Welcome to Insanity Fair. Today I'd like to talk about the case of Jim, the recreational schizophrenic. But before doing so, I think we need to clear up a bit what I mean by schizophrenic or schizophrenia. It's something that everybody has an idea of, because we've all heard of cases of multiple personality, split personality. But we have to be rather careful with this. In current psychiatric practice, the term schizophrenia is not actually applied to multiple personality, which is called multiple personality disorder or dissociative personality disorder. Dissociative identity disorder. Forgive me. And there are problems on both sides of this. Schizophrenia is supposed to be associated with hearing voices, feelings of not being yourself, various psychotic states like that. But the original idea of multiple personality, the split brain as it means in Greek, has really vanished from that. On the other hand, the multiple personality cases which come forward, which are very few, are sometimes seen as being a kind of acting out or theatre even, being iatrogenic, that is caused by therapy, generated by therapy, so that under therapy people come to believe that they have these multiple personalities, and then they're encouraged by the therapist to express them, and this carries over into their everyday life. That seems a little bit far-fetched in some cases, but in others it seems like a very good explanation. However, what I'd like to think about is something a little deeper than that. If we look at Freud has this idea of the ego, the id, and the superego all being expressed simultaneously. There are not very many psychologists who would accept Freud at face value anymore. But I think that the idea that we have more than one element in our personality is the kind of deep thought that I'd like to look at there. Okay, on to Jim. Now, Jim was someone that I knew quite well in the early 1980s. This was in the context of a large house with a number of people sharing the house, unemployed people in London. And Jim was a very intelligent man. He had done a doctorate at Cambridge University. And while he was there, he'd also been involved in the Cambridge University theatre scene, the Footlights Company, I believe. And then he had switched to the West End Theatre, where he worked as a stage manager. And this was all fine, but the fly in the ointment was that he became a very bad alcoholic. Bad, I don't know. A severe alcoholic. And he then got married to another alcoholic, a model, and while they were both continuing to work, they would get drunk together at home and they would fight all the time, screaming matches, and I think some actual physical fighting. He came home one day and found that she had committed suicide, killed herself, and left a note blaming him. He went to pieces completely, became a full-time alcoholic, stopped working, and he said one day he woke up with a hangover and he thought, I've got to stop drinking, and he went into a chemist's and asked if they had anything, and they gave him a bottle of some kind of tonic which contained opiates. Codeine. This would have been in the 1970s, and you could still buy, I don't know if you can now, I don't think so, you could still buy preparations with opiates. And he very quickly stopped drinking and became a codeine addict. And when I met him, he'd been a stable codeine addict for, I don't know, I would guess between 5 and 10 years. And he was living on benefits, and he was not a healthy man. He had very bad skin and a very poor diet. But he was quite stable, and he was psychologically stable. And he saw this as a better alternative to alcoholism. And he was self-medicating, not under medical supervision. Now, he had devoted his considerable intellect to studying drugs, psychiatric drugs of various kinds, mainly. I don't know, actually. He had big, thick books he used to read about it. And what he used to do was to fake the symptoms of various diseases in order to get prescribed particular drugs that he wanted to try. This was on top of his regular codeine intake. And I saw him doing this, and it was quite impressive. Getting himself admitted to hospital by ambulance with completely faked symptoms. Anyway, he spent a few months collecting various drugs because he was planning a kind of party. He wanted to have a special event which was taking a particular cocktail of drugs. I don't know what the drugs were, but he'd been planning this quite carefully. And then one day he took this cocktail of drugs, and it affected us all, the housemates, quite profoundly. We talked about it for a long time afterwards, because he seemed to go, what we could say is completely mad. That's how it felt at the time, but in a very specific way. What happened was that his core personality, Jim, that we all knew, completely disappeared. And what was there instead was a whole series of other personalities. Now, in the multiple personality cases which are reported, you'll typically have a fairly small number of personalities. You know, you'll have a core personality and then maybe 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other personalities that come out. I've seen descriptions of cases in which there is no core stable personality, but I haven't actually seen any video of such a case. But with Jim it wasn't like that at all. Now, one thing that he did early on during this adventure was to go into the kitchen and get some knives. And this was obviously extremely dangerous. So we all felt that we had to supervise him and not leave him alone, because we didn't want him to harm himself or to attack anybody else. And so we all sat with him. We took turns. This went on for 4 or 5 hours, so there's plenty of time to observe. And what was happening was he was becoming various real people. His mother, his father, various other relatives that we couldn't identify, children, himself as a child probably, but also definitely other children he'd been at school with, maybe, boys and girls. That was one thing that was quite clear, that many of the personalities were women. He was being me once. That was a very weird experience. He had taken his whole understanding of me, he had integrated it, and he was able to reproduce it. Quite accurately, actually. And some of these personalities were quite sort of dysfunctional, like the one who wanted knives. I don't remember who it was, but this wasn't knives for cooking. This was meant to be knives as weapons. And there was some who were sort of frightened or had some kind of negative thing. But what was very striking was just the extent to which they would, the speed at which they would flash through. He would just, as soon as he was focused on one thing, he would have an appropriate personality for that one thing. But then he would just glance away, and instantly he would have another personality to deal with the next thing. And they could last for seconds, or they could last for minutes. And as the experience went on, they lasted longer and longer, and they were less marked. And then he began to feel very tired, and eventually he went off to his bed, and he woke up the next morning and came out, and I saw him and I said, "Jim, are you all right?" He said, yes, of course, why?" I said, "Well, I thought you were going crazy." He said, "How unsophisticated of you." And he was fine, in fact. He seemed a little tired, but he wasn't shaky or mad or crazy or anything. So what does this mean? That's what I think of as the core reality of schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder, or whatever we want to call it. That this is the basic reality. I think it's connected with mirror neurons, and it demonstrates to me that when we meet people and we empathise with them, we actually absorb their whole personality. It becomes a part of our repertoire of personalities, and that our normal behaviour is just a blend of all of these personalities that we've learned, and we've learned how to produce them, and we will vary this mix as appropriate for different things. So if we've met somebody who's very brave, who we think of as very brave, when we have to confront a frightening experience, we will call up this personality, this brave person, which is not necessarily us, it's someone that we've learned and acquired. And I think that this is behind a lot of these cases of psychological breakdown. I think also in what is called schizophrenia in current psychiatric practice, hearing voices, for example. I think that there is some mechanism like this, which is I'm sure a neurophysiological function behind it. And as I say, this marked my own thinking a lot, and it's something that I see happening in people generally. So although Jim was in a bad way in many ways, I am grateful to him for this insight that he gave me.